White cops set a trap for a black woman, not knowing she's a CIA agent. The truth explodes in court. Late at night in a quiet town in Virginia, two police officers pulled over a black woman, accusing her of a crime she didn't commit. What should have been a quick routine stop turned into something much darker, a carefully orchestrated setup. But what these officers didn't know was that their target was not just an ordinary woman, but someone with the power to expose everything they thought they controlled. It was a quiet night in Arlington, Virginia, the streetlights flickering on the empty sidewalks, and occasionally a car speeding down the desolate roads. In the driver's seat of a sleek black SUV, Talia Porter sat behind the wheel. Her hands relaxed on the steering wheel as she glided through the suburban neighborhood. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, just after midnight. It had been a long day, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. Her covert operation in this small town was coming to an end, and she had everything she needed to get out safely. Only a short distance left, and she would be out of here, back to her world, the one where she belonged. As she neared a quiet intersection, the faint light from a stop sign reflected on her windshield. With instincts honed from years of field agent training, Talia noticed every detail, no matter how small. She slowed down, came to a complete stop, her hands steady on the wheel, then slowly turned left onto the next street. Just minutes later, red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. The blaring sirens shattered the stillness of the night. Talia's heart didn't race. She had been trained for moments like this. Instead, her mind sharpened, her breathing steady, quickly assessing the situation. She glanced in the mirror and saw a patrol car approaching, its headlights casting long shadows on her dashboard. With the calm of someone who had been trained, she slowly steered to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and reached for her glove compartment for her license and registration. She didn't act nervous, an attitude she knew could make many cops feel challenged. But she also couldn't appear scared. The patrol car stopped right behind her, the lights still flashing. Talia could see the silhouettes of two officers stepping out of the car, their movements cautious, but purposeful. The driver, a tall man with a square jaw and an imposing demeanor, was the first to approach. His companion, shorter but stockier, followed closely behind. Both were dressed in the dark blue uniforms of the Arlington Police Department, their badges gleaming under the streetlights. Talia quietly observed as they approached, quickly reading their name tags: Officer Brandon Carter and Officer Mark Sullivan. Carter leaned down, his sharp gaze cutting through the window at her. He casually flashed a flashlight into the car, the beam sweeping across her face. His voice echoed with the authority of someone accustomed to power. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" Talia kept a neutral expression, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No, officer," she answered flatly. "I wasn't speeding, and I came to a complete stop at the intersection." Carter sneered, his eyes flashing with derision. "Actually, you didn't stop," he said, "and that's a traffic violation." Talia's brow furrowed slightly, but she remained calm. "I'm sure I stopped, officer," she replied, her voice even but firm. Carter tilted his head, his smirk widening a little more. "You're mistaken," he interrupted. "License and registration." Talia slowly handed over her documents, careful with every movement. She knew how to handle this situation, not giving them any reason to escalate. Carter took her paperwork, glanced over them. His eyes lingered a little longer on the address. "Do you live around here?" he asked, his voice almost as if lost in thought. Talia nodded. "Yes, officer." At that moment, Sullivan, who had been lingering behind her vehicle, suddenly called out, "Hey, Carter! You might want to come take a look at this." Carter raised an eyebrow, looking toward his partner. He handed the documents back to Talia without comment. "Stay in the car," he ordered, before turning back toward the rear of her SUV. Talia clenched her jaw, watching the rearview mirror. She saw Sullivan pointing at something in her trunk, his voice low and laden with implication. Carter nodded, and they exchanged a look filled with meaning. In that moment, a sharp warning surged through Talia's chest. It wasn't fear. She rarely felt fear. It was instinct. Something was wrong. A few minutes later, Carter returned to her window, but this time, his expression had changed. It was darker. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he commanded. Talia tilted her head, her voice still calm but laced with curiosity. "May I ask why, officer?" Carter crossed his arms. "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." Talia's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances?" she repeated. "I think you've made a mistake." Carter smirked. "We'll see about that." And in that moment she knew she had been set up. The air around her seemed to thicken as Carter slowly approached Talia's vehicle. Under the flashing lights of the patrol car, his expression hardened. No longer the detached coldness of an officer simply doing his duty, but the smug satisfaction of someone who believed they were in complete control of the game. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Carter's harsh voice shattered the silence, like a gunshot signaling the start of a chess match. Talia didn't rush to comply. She tilted her head, her sharp eyes assessing every line on Carter's face, every wrinkle on his brow, the sign of someone relishing their power. She knew this game. She had seen it too many times. A carefully orchestrated scenario, a sophisticated trap with every piece set in place from the start. And tonight, they thought she was the prey. She asked softly, her voice unwavering. "May I ask why, officer?" Carter stood taller, exchanging a glance with Sullivan before declaring, "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Talia could feel each beat of her heart, not from fear, but from the simmering anger beneath it. She knew for sure this couldn't be a mistake. She wasn't carrying anything illegal. She wasn't careless. She had checked thoroughly before getting into the car. That meant it had been planted there. Sullivan pretended to crouch by the trunk, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who already knew the answer. He touched a small unlabeled bag, lifting it like he had just found treasure. He whistled in mock surprise. "Oh, a nice little bag of powder?" Carter laughed, taking a step forward, standing level with Talia. She didn't move, didn't back away an inch. He held up the bag of powder, spinning it between his fingers, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "Anything you'd like to say?" This was the crucial moment. A normal person, faced with this situation, might have started trembling, panicking, begging, or worse, trying to argue and escalate the situation. But Talia was no ordinary person. She didn't do anything Carter expected. No panic, no pleading gaze. Instead, a faint smile appeared on her lips. Not overly obvious, but enough to make Carter pause for a fraction of a second. Her voice rang out, steady like a sharp blade slicing through the tense air. "I'll save my comments for a more appropriate setting." More appropriate setting. Those two words carried an unseen weight, a hidden message that Carter couldn't help but feel. Her calm wasn't acceptance. It was a warning. But Carter wasn't the type to be easily rattled. He smirked, laughing dismissively, as if her words meant nothing. "You'll have your chance, in front of a judge." Then the cold click of handcuffs rang out. Sullivan grabbed Talia's wrist, twisting it behind her back and cuffing her without hesitation. She didn't resist, didn't jerk her arm away or argue. She let them do what they thought they could do, because this game wasn't over yet. They thought they had won, but they didn't know they had just opened the door to their own downfall. The patrol car sped through the night, the red and blue lights reflecting off the buildings on either side of the road. Inside, Talia sat silently in the back seat, her wrists handcuffed behind her, her back pressed against the cold cushion. No sighs, no unnecessary movements, just sharp eyes scanning every detail within the cabin of the vehicle. The engine rumbled, blending with the heavy silence. Ahead, Carter glanced at the rearview mirror, watching her expression. He expected to see a sign of unease, anxiety, perhaps a little fear. But all he saw was a suspicious calmness. "You don't seem worried." Carter's voice broke the silence, tinged with sarcasm and challenge. Talia looked into his eyes through the mirror, her gaze sharp as a knife, showing no sign of wavering. "Should I be?" Her answer was cold, not a rebuttal but an implicit statement. She wasn't the type to be easily defeated. Carter raised an eyebrow, then chuckled condescendingly. "Are you brave or just foolish?" Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to prove anything to them, but in her mind, she was piecing everything together. They didn't pull her over by accident. They knew who she was before they turned on the siren. The bag of powder in the trunk wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a small-time corruption. This was a well-planned setup. The most important question was, who were they working for? The car slowed down and turned into the Arlington Police Department's parking lot. The car door opened. Carter grabbed her arm and yanked her out, but Talia didn't lose her balance. She calmly stepped out, her eyes quickly scanning the layout of the building in front of her. An old police station. Flickering fluorescent lights. The white painted walls had turned yellowish. Everything about it exuded an old, conservative feel and a rot from within. But she didn't have time to assess the architecture. Her target was the people. Inside, she saw about half a dozen officers lazily leaning against tables, sipping coffee, chatting. Some glanced over as Carter and Sullivan led her in, but no one asked any questions. They weren't surprised. This was normal around here. Their silence was complicity. Carter pulled Talia to the reception desk, then dramatically announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "We've got a big one tonight." Sullivan chuckled smugly, tossing the bag of powder onto the counter, caught red-handed. A few officers nearby smirked, but no one asked for more details. No one questioned whether Talia actually owned the substance. No one checked the dashcam footage. No one questioned the traffic stop report. That said a lot. Their silence was complicity. Talia maintained absolute calm. No arguments, no futile attempts to defend herself. But in her mind, everything was starting to shift. She was noting every detail. The position of the surveillance cameras, the layout of the reception desk, which officers seemed familiar with Carter and Sullivan. Who was looking at her with wariness? Who was looking at her with smug satisfaction? These little pieces would matter when the time was right. A young officer, James Keller, stood near the reception desk, tapping his fingers lightly on the old wooden counter. His eyes flicked over the computer screen, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Around the Arlington police station, everything was still moving to the familiar rhythm of the night shift. The coffee percolating, officers lazily chatting, papers rustling from a corner of the room. But what caught Keller's attention wasn't those sounds. It was the woman standing in front of him, Talia Porter. She stood tall, not bowed like the other suspects Keller had seen. No anxiety, no fidgeting, no nervous, evasive glance. Instead, she held her gaze steady, with a resilient silence, as though she had been in far more tense situations before this. Talia was handcuffed, but she showed no signs of submission. Keller had seen many suspects come into the police station in this situation. People with frightened, angry faces, sometimes pleading or overreacting. But this woman wasn't like that. Her calmness almost felt unnatural. Carter and Sullivan stood behind, casually joking, clearly satisfied with their work. Sullivan kept his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the station like everything was already in the bag. Carter leaned against the counter, his posture smug, his eyes challenging as he looked at Talia. "Enter her info into the system." "Keller," Carter said, his tone carrying a hint of an order. "She's not going anywhere." Keller slowly nodded, pulling the keyboard closer. "Name?" Talia looked at him, her eyes unflinching. "Talia Porter." Keller's fingers moved across the keyboard, typing out the characters one by one. "Occupation?" Talia leaned forward slightly, her voice low but clear enough to catch attention. "Consultant." Keller frowned. He had expected a different answer, perhaps a more specific occupation, a more detailed explanation. But instead, she just gave him one word. "Consultant." Keller paused for a second, then continued inputting data. "Consultant in what?" he asked, trying to make the question sound casual, not too suspicious. Talia didn't blink. "A lot of things." Her answer wasn't direct, but it wasn't entirely evasive either. She spoke slowly, calmly, as if she had thought carefully about every word before speaking. Something was off. Keller wasn't the type to dig into things that didn't concern him, at least not when he first joined the force. He had learned one thing in his early days at the station. Don't ask too many questions, especially when your superiors don't want them asked. But right now, there was an uncomfortable feeling in his chest, a sense that something wasn't right about this arrest. He glanced at the screen again, checking Talia's information. Her address was listed on her driver's license, a normal neighborhood in Arlington, with no suspicious signs, no criminal record, no history of offenses, no indicators that she could be involved in drugs. But one thing stood out to Keller more than anything. There was no specific occupation listed for her. Most people arrested had a clear personal record: teacher, office worker, engineer, doctor, driver. But with Talia, everything was vague. "Where do you work?" he asked, his eyes not leaving the screen. Talia gave a slight smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more of a knowing smile. "I work in many places." Once again, her answer wasn't direct. But instead of making Keller less suspicious, it only made him feel more uncomfortable. Talia didn't look like a drug dealer. She didn't look like a criminal. She didn't look like someone who deserved to be handcuffed and standing here. But if that was the case, why did Carter and Sullivan seem so certain about this arrest? Keller glanced at Carter, who was still leaning against the counter, chatting with another officer. He looked too confident, too comfortable, as if this was more of a formality than an actual arrest. Talia hadn't done anything to warrant being arrested. According to the report, she was pulled over for a traffic violation. But that violation was just Carter's statement. No dashcam evidence, no other witnesses except the two officers who had arrested her. And then, a bag of white powder appeared in her trunk. Keller looked down at the file once more, his fingers stopping at the line that read, "Arrested for possession of illegal substances with intent to distribute." It seemed too easy. The discomfort in Keller's chest grew stronger, not because he believed Talia was innocent, but because everything about this arrest seemed too perfectly orchestrated to be believable. But what could he do? He was just a young officer, barely into his first year at the station. He knew how things worked here. The senior officers were in control, and guys like him just followed orders. He had heard unofficial warnings from colleagues when he first joined. Don't question Carter or Sullivan. Don't be the fool trying to dig into things that aren't your business. But right now, something inside Keller was telling him that if he turned a blind eye, an innocent person might be destroyed because of it. Keller glanced at Talia again. She was still standing there, unwavering. No arguments, no defense, no pleading. As though she was absolutely sure that justice would ultimately be on her side. Keller clenched his fist. He didn't know what to do right now. But he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore this feeling anymore. The darkness enveloped the cold holding cell, with only the faint glow from the fluorescent lights in the hallway, casting dim patches of light onto the gray concrete floor. The air was thick. Still, the only sound was the faint hum from the ventilation system. The heavy iron bars cast long shadows on the wall, emphasizing the isolation that was meant to be imposed on her. Talia sat upright on the metal chair bolted to the wall, her hands resting calmly on her thighs. She didn't seem hurried or anxious. She knew this game, the game of those who abused power, confident they were in control. She understood that what they most wanted was to see her panic, to see her fall into their trap, beg, or react uncontrollably. But Talia Porter was not that type of person. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to rest, but to focus. Her breath was steady, silent like still water, but inside her, a storm was beginning to form. She had been a spy for too long to understand that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun or physical strength, but patience. Outside the holding cell, footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, rhythmic, predictable. She had been observing since she was brought in. Every 7 minutes, an officer would pass by the cell, but no one really paid attention to her. People like Carter and Sullivan were too confident in their victory, thinking she had no way out. But they had made a fatal mistake. Talia wasn't alone. She subtly moved her right hand, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her jacket. A small tracking device sat inside the lining, a standard tool for CIA agents operating in the field. It was no bigger than a coin, but its power could change the entire course of events. She gently pressed the device, activating it with a pressure nearly undetectable. A faint click sounded, almost inaudible to the human ear. She knew that at that exact moment a signal had been sent. Not far from the Arlington police station, an otherwise nondescript office suddenly became a flurry of activity. The computer screen immediately received the signal, a red light flashing on the security interface. A neatly groomed agent with dark hair spun around in his chair, typing rapidly on the keyboard. Signal received. Location confirmed. Target, Talia Porter. His voice was calm but decisive. An older man, graying hair, walked over. He stared intently at the screen, his sharp eyes unwavering. She's on time. His eyes flicked to another screen, a satellite image of the Arlington police station, an old building with red dots marking the positions of security cameras. We've been waiting for this, he said in a steady voice. "Deploy the team immediately. No mistakes." Meanwhile, inside the police station, Carter and Sullivan were relaxing in the break room. They were too familiar with nights like this. Easy arrests, targets who had no way to defend themselves, and their antics always covered up by a system of complicity. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, lifting his cup of coffee to take a hot sip. He nodded toward Carter, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Did you see her face?" "Not a bit of fear." Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "I've seen plenty of people trying to act tough before they're thrown into a cell. By tomorrow morning, she'll realize she's just another name in the system." Sullivan snickered. "Who does she think she is? A lawyer? An activist? She doesn't know what the law means in this town." Carter leaned back, a smirk crossing his face. "Let's see how tough she is when she faces the judge. They won't show mercy to someone like her." They continued chatting, their words dripping with smugness and arrogance, echoing in the small room. But they didn't know. They didn't know that just a few blocks away, a team of agents was preparing to disrupt their entire plan. They didn't know that a signal had been sent, and the game they thought they controlled was nearing its end. They didn't know that the woman they held wasn't a helpless victim, but someone smart enough to turn their trap into a counterstrike. They didn't know that tonight, everything was going to change. Talia still sat silently, but inside, she knew that with every passing second, her team was getting closer. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to show fear. Everything had been set up perfectly. She heard the change in the rhythm of footsteps. There was a small disturbance in the hallway. An officer whispered to a colleague. A brief silence before they returned to their work. Talia closed her eyes for a moment. She could feel something in the air shifting. Perhaps it was instinct. The same instinct honed over years in the field, in the most dangerous missions. Perhaps it was absolute faith in her team. But the most important thing was, she knew she wasn't here to be defeated. Talia opened her eyes. Her gaze was sharp, glowing in the darkness. She wasn't the prey. She was the hunter, and her counterattack had just begun. A screen flickered in the dark room, the blue light from the scrolling data reflecting on the face of Agent Daniel Price. Inside the federal office, the sound of typing on the keyboard seemed to sync with the increasing pulse of a heartbeat. Talia Porter had sent the signal. A steady voice came through the internal intercom. "Signal confirmed. Location, Arlington Police Station." Agent Price showed no surprise. He had been waiting for this. With many years of experience in dismantling corruption networks, he knew that the most rotten things often hid in organizations that were meant to uphold justice. He didn't waste time thinking. "Order an emergency investigation. We proceed now." Outside, it was still dark, but a convoy of unmarked black vehicles silently made their way toward the Arlington Police Station. No sirens, no forewarning, just the shadowy figures of agents in black suits. The doors of the police station opened. A suffocating silence fell over the place as the agents entered. The officers in the station looked up, some startled, others trying to maintain composure, but no one dared speak. The glint of FBI badges under the fluorescent lights immediately changed the atmosphere. Agent Price walked up to the reception desk, his voice firm. "We're the FBI. This is a federal investigation. We need immediate access to the record system." The sergeant on duty raised an eyebrow, trying to mask his confusion. He quickly glanced toward the commanding officer's office, as if seeking confirmation. "What's this about?" "We're not obligated to explain." Agent Price's voice was sharp as a knife. "We have evidence of misconduct in this station. If you refuse to cooperate, I can assure you that you'll be considered an accomplice." The firmness in Price's voice made the entire room tense. A reluctant nod from the sergeant on duty, and he signaled for another officer to open the system. Meanwhile, in a corner of the room, Officer James Keller was more restless than ever. He had observed everything over the course of the night. He had seen Carter and Sullivan stage the arrest, seen their smugness as they entered the break room. But what kept him awake wasn't just Talia Porter's arrest. It was a pattern. He couldn't ignore the abnormalities in their recent arrests. And tonight, with the sudden appearance of the FBI, a larger question rang in his mind. Was this the first time? Or was it just the tip of a massive iceberg? He opened his computer, feeling his palms sweat as he typed a search query into the internal system. The list appeared, A series of arrests with an identical pattern. Traffic stops for minor violations. Searches for suspicious behavior. Finding illegal substances in the trunk. Charges escalated to more severe offenses. Possession and trafficking of drugs. All of these cases were led by two people, Carter and Sullivan. Keller's hand clenched the mouse. He couldn't look the other way anymore. He opened an anonymous email entering the FBI's contact address. A line he knew was only for whistleblowers. Subject: misconduct at Arlington Police Station. Body: I can't stay silent anymore. I have evidence of illegal arrests. The attached files will reveal the truth. I don't know who to trust in this station, but I believe justice needs to be served. He hesitated for a brief moment, then clicked send, a decision he knew would change everything. Carter and Sullivan were still laughing, confident in their victory. Who does she think she is? Carter smirked. She has no way out. Sullivan took a sip of his coffee, nodding. Just another night for us. But then, a shadow flickered across the break room window. The appearance of the FBI agents. A deadly silence suddenly enveloped the room. Carter put his coffee cup down, feeling a chill run down his spine. Sullivan shifted in his chair, eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the situation. What the hell is going on? Carter stood up, walking into the hallway, and froze when he saw Agent Price talking to the sergeant on duty. From his position, Carter could see the computer screen. The FBI was accessing the records. Everything. He felt a surge of unease in his chest. Sullivan moved up behind him, whispering, "We've got a problem." Carter clenched his fists, but he tried to keep calm. Nothing to worry about. We followed protocol, but even he didn't believe his own words anymore. Across the hallway, Keller sat still at his desk, staring at his computer screen. He could feel the storm approaching, and this time, it wasn't coming to crush the innocent. It was coming to wash away those who deserved the consequences. The atmosphere in the Arlington police station grew tense, thick enough to be felt in every breath. FBI agents moved with absolute confidence, surrounding the small room like patient hunters. Every movement was purposeful. Every glance held judgment. At the center of the storm, Carter and Sullivan stood opposite Agent Daniel Price, trying to maintain their false confidence. Carter's hands clenched. Sullivan stood stiffly, his eyes fixed on the file that Price was holding. "Officers Carter and Sullivan, we need you to explain what's in here." Price pushed a file onto the table. Carter smirked, pretending indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about." Price said nothing. He opened the file. Evidence from the security cameras. Clear images captured by the internal cameras in the station, showing Carter and Sullivan holding the bag of powder before Talia's car was searched. Unmistakable. Sullivan immediately turned pale. He stepped back, pressing his back against the wall, as though he could disappear into the cold walls. Carter continued to resist. He crossed his arms, his face showing calm, but his eyes no longer held the same confidence as before. "This doesn't prove anything," he said. "The evidence could have been tampered with. It could just be a coincidence." Price smiled faintly. He pulled a USB drive from his pocket and plugged it into the computer on the table. "You think so?" On the screen, an audio recording began to play. Carter's voice rang out. Sharp, clear, undeniable. "We'll make it look easy. No one will suspect anything. We have everything we need. Drugs, the arrest report, no witnesses. She won't have a way out. She'll just be a number in the system, a forgotten name. All we need to do is stamp the files, and it's done. She won't escape." The room fell completely silent. Everyone could hear the sound of a pin dropping. Carter stood frozen like a statue, his face drained of color. Sullivan bit his lip, his hand trembling. They knew. The game was over. There was no more denial, no escape. They had lost. The FBI had all the evidence they needed. Agent Price leaned forward, his voice slow but heavy with judgment. "You two think you can get away with this? Think no one would suspect you? Think this system will protect you forever?" He looked directly at Carter, then turned to Sullivan. "Wrong." One agent stepped forward. He pulled out handcuffs, the metallic gleam catching the fluorescent light. "Brandon Carter, Mark Sullivan, you are under arrest for abuse of power, falsifying evidence, and unlawful detention." Sullivan didn't say anything, offered no resistance. He only lowered his head, his eyes hollow. But Carter couldn't accept this. "This is a joke! This is a setup!" he shouted, trying to struggle as the agent locked the cuffs around his wrists. "She did this. She set us up. You don't know who she is." But no one cared about his words anymore. The arrogance had vanished. Their mask of power had been torn away. They were no longer the powerful officers. They were the criminals, caught in the very place they once controlled. The other officers in the station dared not speak. Some turned away. Some stood still, silent. They knew the truth had been revealed. The cell door opened. Talia calmly stood up, her black hair reflecting the faint light in the room. She stepped out of the darkness, facing the people who thought they had won. Carter was being dragged away, but he still stared at her, his gaze full of hatred and defeat. Talia only smiled, a smile that carried no pity, no mocking words, no need to say anything, because the truth had spoken for her, and the truth had triumphed. Talia walked toward the door where Agent Price stood waiting. He nodded at her, a sign of acknowledgement. "We have everything we need. You did well." Talia took a deep breath. She looked around the Arlington police station, once the battleground for abused power, for those who believed they could manipulate justice. But tonight they had lost. She stepped outside, inhaling the fresh night air. It was still dark, but for her, dawn had broken. The news exploded across all media outlets, local and national channels, simultaneously reporting the shocking scandal at the Arlington Police Department. Bold headlines flooded the screens. FBI uncovers police corruption ring. Irrefutable evidence. Arlington police officers arrested for falsifying evidence. The system of abuse of power is finally exposed. Footage of Carter and Sullivan being escorted out of the police station in handcuffs was repeatedly aired, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, as they realized their careers were over. The men who had once arrogantly stood atop their power, commanding and manipulating the fates of so many, were now the ones bowing before justice. This image became a symbol of the collapse of a corrupt system. The court swiftly issued indictments against Carter and Sullivan. They were charged with falsifying evidence, abuse of power, unlawful detention, and intentional manipulation of the judicial system. Prosecutors affirmed that their crimes weren't limited to Talia Porter, but formed part of a systemic pattern spanning many years, with dozens of other cases manipulated in the same way. As the case files were reopened, victims who had been ensnared by them finally had the chance to seek justice. At the Arlington Police Department, the aftershocks of the scandal spread. Officers who had remained silent or turned a blind eye to Carter and Sullivan's actions were now forced to confront reality. An internal investigation was launched, and not just the two of them, but many other officers were placed under surveillance. A slew of resignation letters were submitted to the police chief's desk. Those who didn't want to be caught up in the scandal quickly left before being investigated. The atmosphere in the station grew darker than ever. The trust in the Arlington Police Department had been severely shaken. Keller, who had dared to expose the truth, could not escape the personal consequences. Many of his colleagues began to distance themselves, avoiding him in the station. Some looked at him with contempt, seeing him as a traitor, while others kept a neutral stance, afraid to voice an opinion. The veteran officers, who had once seen Carter and Sullivan as teammates, now viewed Keller as the one who had broken the unwritten rule of the force, the rule of silence. However, Keller had no regrets. He knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't make the isolation he was facing any easier. One afternoon, Keller sat alone in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, his hand absent-mindedly stirring his cup of coffee. He wasn't expecting anyone, but when the door to the cafe opened and a woman walked in, he immediately recognized her. Talia Porter. She walked up to his table, pulled out a chair, and sat down, her gaze calm. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," Keller said, his voice hesitant. Talia smiled faintly, a smile that wasn't exactly happy but carried understanding. "You deserve this conversation. Not many people have the courage to do what you did." Keller looked down at the table, conflicted. "I just couldn't keep looking the other way," he said slowly, as though trying to convince himself. "But honestly, I don't know if it will make a difference. The department's still a mess, and people like Carter and Sullivan are still around." Talia tilted her head, looking at him with deep insight. "It makes a difference to the people they've hurt. And it makes a difference to you." Her words made Keller fall silent. For the first time, he allowed himself to think about it differently. Maybe he couldn't change the entire system in one night. Maybe other corrupt individuals still existed, but that didn't mean what he did was meaningless. "What about you? What will you do now?" Keller asked, trying to shift the topic. Talia leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting out the window, where the sunset was beginning to color the sky. "Now I move on to the next mission. There's always another battle." She said it with an odd calmness, as if she had grown too familiar with this cycle. Keller didn't ask further. He knew Talia was not a normal person. She was someone who lived in the shadows to protect the light. Outside the small cafe, the world continued to turn. But for Keller, everything had changed. He was no longer just a rookie cop. He had stepped into a new path, one where justice wasn't just a distant concept, but something he had to fight to protect.